There are stories that time cannot erase. Stories that span centuries, cross borders, survive wars and epidemics, and reach us still alive, still pulsing, still able to move us to tears. The story of Isabel de Hungary is one of those stories. It is the story of a princess born to have everything who chose to give everything away. It is the story of a human love so pure that it became a gateway to divine love. And it is above all the story of a woman who faced the world's misery with open eyes and outstretched hands, without flinching, without shame, without asking permission. Let us begin at the beginning. With the cold of a medieval winter in Central Europe, the year is 1207. Hungary still bears in the stones of its castles the marks of invasions, migrations, and wars that shaped Eastern Europe across centuries. It is a kingdom young in Christian terms, converted only 2 centuries earlier, but already deeply marked by faith. King Andrei II rules with a firm hand and political ambition. His wife, Queen Gertrude de Andechs, is a woman of German origin, cultured, proud, accustomed to the refinements of court life. Gertrude was the sister of Edviges de Andechs, who would later be canonized as Santa Edviges da Silesia. Isabel was thus born already steeped in blood of holiness. Together they inhabit the castle of Sarospatak, in the northeast of the kingdom, where the river Bodrog reflects the gray sky of late autumn. It is in that castle, between stone walls covered with heavy tapestries and corridors lit by torches that crackle in the wind that slips through the cracks, that Isabel is born. The exact place of her birth is still debated by historians, with Bratislava mentioned in some sources. But the most established tradition points to Sarospatak. What matters is not so much the stone of the cradle as the spirit that was kindled there. From her earliest years, those around Isabel noticed something different. It was not just the child's beauty, though she was described as extraordinarily beautiful, with brown hair and bright, deep eyes. It was something that radiated from her when she prayed. Even before she was 4, Isabel would kneel before crucifixes with a seriousness that disconcerted adults. When she played with the other children of the court, she would often interrupt the games to slip into some chapel and remain silent for long minutes. Her tutors did not know whether to feel admiration or mild unease. The medieval court was not a place of innocence. It was a place of power, of calculation, of alliances built on the blood of sons and daughters, given as pieces on a political chessboard. And it was exactly like that Isabel, at only 4 years old, became betrothed. The Landgrave Hermann I de Thuringia, one of the most powerful princes of the Holy Roman Empire, had sent emissaries to the Hungarian court. He wanted an alliance with King Andrei II, and the currency of that alliance would be a child. His daughter Jutta, and later his eldest son Luis, were destined for that union. The agreement was closed with the typical coldness of medieval diplomacy. Isabel would be sent to the court of Wartburg in Thuringia, where she would be raised as the future wife of young Luis. Imagine the scene. A 4-year-old girl, torn from her mother's arms, dressed in traveling clothes far too heavy for such a small body, placed in a cortege that would travel hundreds of kilometers over dirt roads, dense forests, and snow-capped mountains. Chroniclers of the time record that Isabel traveled with a large retinue, bringing with her a trousseau of extraordinary value, including a silver bathtub, garments embroidered with gold, and jewels that reflected the wealth of the Hungarian crown. It was a display of power, it was politics, it was everything but a normal childhood. What did that child feel as she left Hungary? No document tells us, but we can imagine her eyes looking back toward the castle towers, disappearing into the mist as the cortege moved west. We can imagine the tears held back by a child who was already learning, very early, that princesses do not cry in public. The court of Wartburg was imposing. The castle sat atop a hill covered in forests in Thuringia, and from its windows one could see deep valleys and rivers that glittered in summer. It was a vibrant cultural center, frequented by poets, musicians, and knights. The Landgrave Hermann liked art and ostentation. His court was a place of feasts, tournaments, and poetry contests. But it was also a place of rigor, hierarchy, and very high expectations. Isabel grew up there. She learned German with the fluency of one who absorbed it in childhood. She learned to play instruments, to dance, to comport herself at table with the elegance demanded of a future Landgravine. But she never stopped praying. She never ceased seeking the quietest corners of the castle to be alone with God. And she never stopped looking at the poor with an attention that disturbed the courtiers. There was a constant tension. The court expected Isabel to maintain an aloof posture, distant from servants and the destitute. But Isabel insisted on stopping, on looking, on giving. Still a child, she distributed food from the court table to beggars gathered at the castle gates. She would remove jewels from her hair and hand them to those in need. She would enter chapels with her knees on the cold stone floor and remain there until someone came for her. And then came the moment that would change everything. Young Louise truly saw her. Louis de Thuringia was a young man of exceptional character. He was not merely an heir to a throne. He was a man of principle, of courage, of a genuine kindness rarely found among the powerful. When he looked at Isabel, he did not see only the promised bride, the political alliance, the Hungarian princess with the silver trousseau. He saw the woman, and he loved her. The marriage took place in 1221. Isabel was 14, Louis was 21. And what could have been just another medieval marriage of convenience became one of the most beautiful and well-documented love stories of the Middle Ages. The chroniclers who lived among them, including Eisentraud and Gouda, Isabel's ladies-in-waiting, who would later testify in her canonization process, are unanimous. Louis loved Isabel with a devotion that went beyond physical attraction. He admired her, he protected her, he defended her works of charity before courtiers who complained. When his mother and brothers criticized Isabel for giving too much to the poor, for compromising the castle's resources, for humiliating herself before the miserable, Louis silenced them with firmness. There is a phrase attributed to him that sums it all up. When pressured to control his wife, Louis supposedly said something like, "Let my dear Isabel do good. God will reward her, and us with her." He was a man who understood that something greater than the politics and economy of the castle was happening in that woman's life, and he chose to stand by her. For Isabel, Louis's love was a gift from God. She said so openly. She prayed for him with an intensity that moved even the most cynical at court. When he left on military expeditions, she remained on her knees for hours, asking protection for her husband. When he returned, her joy was visible and contagious. It was a human, physical, real love, but also deeply spiritual. It was a love both of them understood as vocation. Have you ever wondered what it would be like to live such a love? A love that does not contradict faith but nourishes it? A love in which the other does not pull you away from God but draws you closer? It was in this context of love and faith that, in 1223, a piece of news arrived at Wartburg that shook Isabel to the core. Friars of a new order had reached the region, followers of a man named Francisco from Assisi in Italy. Men who had renounced everything, who walked barefoot, who embraced lepers, who preached in squares and fields with a joy that seemed supernatural. Franciscan ideals reached Isabel like confirmation, as if someone had finally put into words everything she had felt since childhood, but that the court insisted on suffocating. Voluntary poverty, proximity to the excluded, imitation of Christ not only at the altars but on the roads and hospitals, in famine-stricken fields. Isabel absorbed these ideals with an eagerness that frightened some and moved others. She asked Louis to bring a Franciscan friar to be her confessor and spiritual director. The chosen one was Conrad de Marburg, an austere, rigid man who would later be controversial for his methods. But at that moment, he represented for Isabel a bridge between the burning desire for holiness and the concrete practice of Christian life. She began to confess frequently, to fast, to increase her charity work systematically and organizedly, and then came 1226. The year Central Europe was struck by a sequence of catastrophes that seemed taken from the apocalypse. The winter of 1225 to 1226 was brutal. The snowfalls were too intense, and when the snow melted in spring, the rivers overflowed with a violence that destroyed entire harvests. Floods swept villages away, carried off animals, covered fields that should have fed people for the year. The summer that followed brought drought and excessive heat, destroying what remained. And in autumn, as if nature had not been cruel enough, an epidemic arrived. Famine settled in with the relentless slowness of great medieval tragedies. First the poorest, then those who had once had something, then everyone. The fields around Wartburg filled with gaunt figures. Children, with swollen bellies, old people who no longer had the strength to beg. Louis had departed for an imperial diet in Cremona, serving Emperor Federico II. An imperial diet was the great assembly of princes, bishops, and nobles of the Holy Roman Empire, convened by the emperor to deliberate on political, military, and religious matters affecting the entire empire. Isabel remained at Wartburg as regent, and it was then that she made one of the boldest and most controversial decisions of her life. She opened the castle granaries. She did not merely distribute the surplus. She did not merely give what remained. She opened the strategic grain stores of Thuringia, the reserve that would guarantee the food supply of the court and the troops. She ordered the grain to be turned into bread and distributed that bread to hundreds, then thousands of people who came from all directions around the castle. The castle stewards were desperate. The councillors protested. Some even wrote to Louis to warn him that his wife was compromising the principality's finances. But Isabel did not stop. She descended from the castle every day with baskets, with her servants, with her ladies-in-waiting, and distributed food with her own hands. She touched the sick. She looked into the eyes of each person who received bread. When Louis learned what his wife had done, he did not reprimand her. There are accounts suggesting, he said, with a calm that disconcerted his counselors, that Isabel had done the right thing, that God would not leave the principality without resources because of acts of mercy. But Isabel was not satisfied with distributing bread. She wanted more. She wanted the sick to have a dignified place to be cared for. At the foot of Wartburg Hill, on land ceded by the Landgrave Louis family itself, Isabel ordered a hospital to be built. It was not an imposing structure. It was a simple building of wood and stone with a thatched roof, small windows to retain heat in winter. But it had 28 beds, 28 places where the sick could lie down, be covered with blankets, receive hot food and rudimentary medical care. Isabel went to that hospital every day. She herself changed dressings. She herself washed the bodies of the gravely ill. She herself stayed at the side of the dying, holding their hands, praying softly, accompanying the passage between this world and the next. Her ladies-in-waiting, raised in courtly culture, were horrified. But Isabel did not care about their horror. She cared about those who suffered. And it was during that period, that winter of famine and disease, that something happened that Christian tradition would keep forever. One morning, Isabel left the castle carrying bread hidden beneath her cloak. She did this frequently, taking food to the poor who could not reach the gates. But that day, Louis had returned from one of his expeditions and was coming down toward her along the steep path of the hill. He saw her with the voluminous cloak, clearly carrying something, and asked what she had. There was tension in that moment, not because Louis suspected his wife, but because the looks of the courtiers who accompanied them weighed on the two of them. Isabel opened her cloak, and where there should have been bread, there were roses. White and red roses, fresh, fragrant, impossible in that winter of snow and ice. Louis was silent for a moment. Then, according to witnesses, he smiled, made the sign of the cross, and let his wife pass. The miracle of the roses is one of the most beloved in medieval hagiography. Some interpret it literally. Others see it as a symbolic image of the transformation God's love operates in the material world. But what no interpretation can erase is what it reveals about Louis, a man who, faced with the inexplicable, was not afraid. He had faith, and he let his wife go. But there was another episode. An episode that goes beyond the beautiful and enters the realm of the unsettling, the disturbing, the deeply Christian. One day, Isabel brought into the castle a man covered in leprosy. Leprosy was the most feared disease of the Middle Ages. Those who contracted it were legally declared dead by society, forced to wear special clothes, to carry a bell to warn others of their approach, to live outside city walls. To touch a leper was considered an act of madness or of holiness, sometimes both at once. The leper's name was Helias. Isabel had found him near the castle, in deplorable condition. She brought him inside, ordered him bathed, his wounds dressed, and then, to the absolute horror of all present, placed him in the marital bed, the bed she shared with Louis. When Louis arrived and was informed of what had happened, the court expected an outburst of anger. The prince's bed, the most intimate symbol of power and honor for a medieval noble, occupied by a leper. Louis approached the bed, and those present report that, upon looking at the leper, he did not see a man deformed by disease. He saw the face of Christ crucified. The account is preserved in the documents of Isabel's canonization process, narrated by her ladies-in-waiting who were present. Louis remained silent. Then he knelt, and he did not utter a single word of reproach to his wife. This episode is one of the most powerful in all medieval hagiography, because it does not speak only of Isabel's holiness, it speaks of Louis's holiness, of a man who, out of love for his wife and faith in God, was capable of seeing beyond what his eyes showed, of a man who understood that his wife was not transgressing. She was revealing. If Santa Isabel's unconditional love for the poor is touching your heart, subscribe to the channel now and leave your like on this video. This simple gesture helps us continue bringing these stories to more people who need to hear them. Each subscriber, each like, is a way to take part in this mission. Because Isabel's story is not over. In fact, we are only at the beginning. What comes next will demand all your courage to hear. It was September of 1227. The German summer still warmed the stones of Wartburg Castle, but there was a different chill in the air that day. Louis IV, Landgrave of Thuringia, a young, strong man of only 27 years, was preparing to depart. He had made a vow, a sacred vow. He would join the Sixth Crusade, the expedition that Emperor Federico II had promised to the papacy, and which, after postponements and endless political tensions, finally seemed to be taking shape. Isabel was pregnant. It was her third child. She was 20 years old. Imagine the scene. The castle courtyard, stones wet with morning dew, knights in armor, banners with the Red Cross, horses neighing with that nervous impatience animals show when they sense something big is about to happen. And there, in the middle, a 20-year-old woman with a growing belly, her hair covered, holding her husband's hands with a grip meant to say everything words could not. Louis did not want to go. Or rather, he wanted to because he was a man of honor, but he did not want to leave Isabel. They were, by all historical accounts that reached us, an extraordinarily united couple. It was not merely a political marriage like so many of medieval nobility. It was love. Real. Deep. The kind of love built day by day, in mutual admiration, in respect for each other's faith. Louis admired Isabel's charity. He did not merely tolerate it, as many men of his position would have. He admired it, he protected it, and now he had to depart. Historians note that Isabel accompanied him for part of the way. She walked beside him for some distance, as if each step were an attempt to delay the inevitable. And when the moment of the real farewell came, the final embrace, the last look, neither knew, but both perhaps felt, that it was the last goodbye. Louis traveled south through Germany. The plan was to embark from Italian ports and cross the Mediterranean to the Holy Land. But fate, or rather Providence, had other plans. When he reached Otranto, at the southern tip of Italy, the port city that served as the departure point for the east, Louis fell ill. Fever struck suddenly, as it did in those times, without warning, without mercy. It was the kind of fever the Crusaders knew well, likely malaria, or some devastating intestinal infection common in overcrowded and unsanitary military camps of the period. Within days, Louis IV, Landgrave of Thuringia, husband of Isabel, father of 3 children, a man who never saw the Holy Land, was dead. He was 27 years old. It was September of 1227. The German people would call him for centuries, Der Heilige, the Saint, out of popular devotion, recognizing in him a man of virtue and justice. The Church, however, never opened a formal beatification process. He remains one of those good men whom history keeps in the memory of the people, even without the official seal of sanctity. The news reached Wartburg a few weeks later. How do you tell a 20-year-old pregnant woman that her husband is dead? How do you prepare someone for that kind of news? There is no gentle way. There is no right word. And Isabel, when she received the news, reacted in the only way a soul completely surrendered to love can react. She collapsed. Historical accounts, including depositions collected for the canonization process, describe Isabel rushing through the castle corridors screaming. It was not the contained cry of a princess trained to keep composure. It was the scream of a woman who had lost half of herself. She struck her head against the wall. She fell to the floor, and in the midst of that agony, between sobs that seemed to tear something from within her, she spoke words that crossed the centuries and reached us as one of the most human and devastating testimonies in the history of the saints. The whole world has died for me. 5 words. 5 words that carry an entire universe of pain. It was not a dramatic line from someone seeking to impress. It was the most honest expression possible of an inner reality. Louis was not only her husband. He was her protector, her friend, the only one who understood her mission, the only one who defended her when the court criticized her for giving too much, for mixing too much with the poor, for loving too much. Without Louis, Isabel was alone, pregnant, in a castle that was not hers by blood right, surrounded by people who had never understood her. And then came the second tragedy, because sorrow sometimes does not come alone. With Louis's death, power in Thuringia passed to his brother Henrique Raspe, and Henrique Raspe was a man of an entirely different nature. Where Louis saw holiness in Isabel's charity, Henrique saw waste. Where Louis saw divine protection in his wife's generosity, Henrique saw a threat to the family's resources. And where Louis saw an extraordinary woman, Henrique saw a problem to be solved. The expulsion was not immediate, but it was inevitable. And when it happened in winter. Try to imagine it. Winter in Thuringia in the 13th century was not like our urban winter today, with central heating and double-glazed windows. It was the cold that penetrates the bones, that freezes the mud in the streets, that turns breath into mist, that makes small children tremble under inadequate blankets. It was that cold Isabel faced when Henrique Raspe expelled her from Wartburg Castle with her children. She had given birth to her 3rd child, Gertrude, shortly after Louis's death. So there she was, less than a year into widowhood, carrying a newborn baby, with 2 small children beside her, descending the stairs of the castle that had been her home for almost 15 years, since she arrived in Thuringia at 4 years old as a promised bride. 15 years. Half of her life. And she left with what she carried on her person. What happened next is one of the most disturbing and at the same time most revealing scenes in the whole history of medieval holiness. Isabel went to the town of Eisenach, at the foot of the mountain where Wartburg stood. And there, in that town where she had distributed bread, where she had healed wounds, where the poor knew her by name, in that very town, no one wanted to give her shelter. Think about that for a moment. The woman who had given her cloak to warm a beggar, who had taken bread from her own table to feed hungry families, who had opened the castle doors in times of crisis. This woman now knocked from door to door in Eisenach and heard silence or the embarrassed recoil of people afraid to defy the new political power in the region. She slept in a stable. Some accounts say it was in a Franciscan convent where she found temporary shelter. Others describe nights spent in conditions utterly degrading for someone of her standing. The humiliation was total. And she accepted it. But she accepted it with a frightening lucidity. Isabel was not being passive. She was being transformed. Each humiliation was another layer being stripped away, revealing what lay beneath. A soul that needed no castle, no title, no wealth to be what it was. What does it mean to lose everything and still not lose yourself? That is the question Isabel's life poses to us today. Because she lost her husband, lost her home, lost her status, lost her security. And in the midst of all that, instead of closing up, instead of becoming bitter, she opened even more. The children could not stay with her. Hermann, the eldest, was placed with noble tutors, for he was the legitimate heir of the Landgraviate and needed to be raised at court. Sophia, the middle daughter, was sent to a convent, where she would later marry Henrique II, Duke of Brabant. And little Gertrude, born after her father's death, was entrusted to the monastery of Altenburg, where she grew up, professed the premonstratensian religious life, and became abbess. She herself would be beatified 6 centuries later, in 1728, by Pope Bento XIII, the Beata Gertrude de Altenburg, whose blood ran with the sanctity she had inherited from her mother. Isabel loved them with all the strength of her heart, and it was precisely out of love for them that she left them in safe hands, knowing that the life she chose to follow was not a life for children. Good Friday of 1228 was one of those moments history keeps with special care. Isabel was in the Church of the Franciscans in Eisenach. It was the Liturgy of the Passion, the day when the whole church prostrates before the wood of the cross. And there, in that sacred silence, before the stripped altar, with images veiled, Isabel made her vow. She formally renounced all worldly goods. She relinquished any claim to property, wealth, or inheritance. She symbolically stripped herself of everything the world considered valuable. And then, with the friar's hands, she put on the gray habit of the Tercera Orden de San Francisco. It was not an impulsive gesture. It was the result of years of inner preparation. It was the logical conclusion of a life that had been, since childhood, a march toward God through the poor. Francisco de Assis had died 2 years earlier in 1226. But his spirit lived on in those friars who had come to Germany and who had found in Isabel one of the most kindred souls the Franciscan charism had ever touched. That same year, Isabel recovered part of her matrimonial dowry, a significant sum of money that legally belonged to her. And with that money, she made a decision that would define the final chapter of her life. She went to Marburg, a smaller, simpler town, without Wartburg's political grandeur. And there, with her own resources, she founded a hospital. It was not a hospital like those we know today. It was a large stone hall with simple beds, where the gravest, the poorest, the most rejected could be received, cared for, and treated with dignity. Isabel did not merely manage the hospital from a distance, issuing orders and supervising. She worked, with her hands, every day. The depositions collected in the canonization process are extraordinarily specific about this. People who knew her described how she washed the sick with her own hands, how she dressed wounds others refused to touch, how she stayed awake all night beside the dying so they would not die alone. One witness described how Isabel personally cared for a boy with leprosy, washing his wounds with a tenderness that made those around her weep. She was 21, 22, 23. And there was Conrad von Marburg. Conrad had been Isabel's confessor for some years before Louise's death. He was a man of genuine faith, but of a hardness that makes us uneasy today. He was an inquisitor, austere, rigorous, and he exercised over Isabel a spiritual authority that, viewed with modern eyes, seems excessive. He deprived her of sleep. He forbade her to give alms without his permission. He separated her from her closest friends, the ladies-in-waiting who had accompanied her since childhood. One of them, Eisentrude, who had grown up alongside Isabel and loved her like a sister, was sent away by Conrad, and Isabel, in obedience to the vow she had made, accepted it. Not without pain. Accounts say she wept much over that separation, but she obeyed. That relationship with Conrad is one of the most complex and debated in medieval hagiography. Some historians see him as a spiritual tyrant. Others see him as a harsh but necessary instrument in the formation of an extraordinary soul. What is certain is that Isabel, even under that severe authority, never lost her inner joy. She never lost her tenderness for the poor. She never lost that luminosity everyone who knew her described, with words that repeat in the historical records. She shone. But the body has its limits. Isabel had given herself completely. The work in the hospital, the fasting, the sleepless nights, the grief never fully processed. All of it took its toll. In the last months of 1231, she fell ill, a high, persistent fever that would not relent. She went to bed and did not rise again. Those at her side in her final days described a scene of extraordinary peace. Isabel, lying on that simple bed in Marburg, spoke in a low voice. Sometimes she prayed. Sometimes she smiled for no apparent reason. One witness said that at a certain moment she began to sing softly, as if answering something only she could hear. In the early hours of November 17, 1231, Isabel de Aragao, who had been born a Princess of Hungary, who had been Landgrave of Thuringia, who had chosen to be a servant of the poor, closed her eyes for the last time. She was 24 years old. That same night, elsewhere, a Franciscan lay brother named Irmão Giordano awoke with intense pain. He had broken his arm. He was alone, suffering, when he had a vision. Isabel appeared to him, radiant, dressed in the Franciscan habit, with a smile of absolute peace. And the pain ceased. The arm healed. When word of Isabel's death reached him, he understood what had happened. It was the first miracle. It would not be the last. Isabel's tomb in Marburg immediately became a place of pilgrimage. Healings multiplied. Accounts came from everywhere. Blind people regained sight. Paralytics walked again. The sick, whom contemporary medicine had abandoned, after praying at Isabel's tomb, regained health. Pope Gregorio IX, who had known Isabel personally when she was young and who had followed her path from afar with growing admiration, did not wait. On May 27, 1235, just 4 years after her death, he solemnly canonized her. 4 years. In the history of the Church, it is one of the fastest canonization processes ever recorded. A lightning canonization, as if heaven were in a hurry to confirm what the earth already knew. At the canonization ceremony, the Emperor Federico II himself, the same who had called the crusade in which Louis died, was present. He personally placed a gold crown on Isabel's relics. It was a gesture laden with immense symbolic weight. The woman who had chosen poverty received, in death, the crown she had refused in life. Santa Isabel de Hungary was 24 when she died, 24 years. Less time than many of us take to discover what we want to do with our lives. And in that brief time, she loved with an intensity that has crossed 8 centuries and still reaches us today. If this story has touched something in you, share this video with someone who needs to know the strength of Christian charity. Because stories like this should not be kept hidden. They need to circulate. They need to reach the right people at the right moment. Santa Isabel found her inspiration in the friars minor of São Francisco. Those men in gray habits who received her vow, who walked beside her, who accompanied her to the end. And so, if you want to understand where this revolution of love and poverty that transformed Isabel and transformed medieval Europe came from, go to the video linked in the description and learn the full story of São Francisco de Assis.